Hey everybody, this is JGB and co-host Poppers. Let's go over what happened yesterday in the Big Ten, because that was the only ranked team that played was Michigan. And let's go over all of Saturday's games. Insanity shall occur. So, in the Big Ten yesterday, many of you might have known, Michigan beat Purdue, sending Purdue to 5th place in the Big Ten, and it gives Michigan a little bit of an edge over teams like Iowa and Wisconsin, have a good one-game lead ahead of them for first place. So not anything huge happened in the Big Ten yesterday, but still a very reasonable win for a pretty good Michigan team. Not to mention the fact that it ended a 4 straight days where we had at least one ranked upset. So that was unfortunate. But let's go over what happens in each conference. Let's do it by conference, okay? So, as many of you know, there's about 3 ranked teams in the Big East. So, let's go over what would happen with a win. So, if you did not know, Villanova plays UConn Creighton plays UConn. So, a loss by Creighton would be pretty devastating to them. Again, it would put them at 6-4. They'd fall behind Seton Hall, and I'm not positive, but I think UConn would pass them as well. Now, so that could be a devastating chain of events for Creighton. Now, if Creighton wins, though, they move to 7-3, retain position of that number 2 spot, and UConn would fall to 4-3, and I believe Xavier would pass them. So, again, UConn could rise up to the 3 spot with a win, and UConn could fall to the 5 spot with a loss. So, some important things going on for UConn. So, what would happen if Villanova was to lose? So, Villanova is pretty crazy. So, if a chain of events happen where Villanova loses, basically everyone, Creighton and Seton Hall would both pass them. So, there is a chain of events where if Creighton wins and Villanova loses to Providence, that Creighton would actually take the lead in the Big East. A pretty crazy chain of events. Again, I don't know if that's likely to happen, though, because Villanova has yet to lose since the Virginia Tech game. Seton Hall gave them a close game this week, though, so anything's possible. Also, Providence was able to beat Creighton this week as well. So, some crazy stuff happened this week in the Big East. Now, what would happen with a Providence win and a Villanova loss? As I said before, Villanova would fall down to the 3 seed. They would still be ahead of a team like UConn, although not by much. So, what would happen with a win for Providence? They move to 5-4. Again, I don't think that's enough to pass a 3-2 Xavier squad, but I'm not positive. I don't think so, though. I think a 3-2 record's better than a 5-4 record in win percentage-wise. On the other hand, with a Providence loss, they move to 4-5. They would drop 1 spot behind Marquette. Marquette also already has a quality win in Wisconsin and Creighton. So it's going to be interesting moving forward to see how Marquette gets into that conversation of stuff as well. So some crazy stuff can happen in the Big East with some upsets. Let's go back to the Big Ten for a little bit, because there are pretty good Big Ten teams that play today, including Maryland, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio State. I believe that's it, yeah. So, I don't believe Iowa or Michigan plays today, so those would be the ranked teams that are playing today. So, Maryland plays Minnesota. So, what happens if each team wins? So, Minnesota wins. They move to 12-4 on the year and 5-4 in conference. Now, what happens with Minnesota entirely depends on what happens with the Ohio State team who is playing Wisconsin. Now, again, if Wisconsin loses, if Ohio State wins and Wisconsin loses, Ohio State moves up to the 5 spot past Purdue, right? Because they get to 6-4, same conference record, but they pass them due to a better overall record. So And what would happen with an Ohio State win, so Wisconsin would lose, right? They dropped to 6-3, 12-4 overall. They'd stay in the 3 spot, But again, they're really in all ways tied for 2, so they'd fall from really 2 to 3rd. So that's not ideal if you're talking about Wisconsin. If you're a Wisconsin fan, so with the Wisconsin win, I don't believe Iowa plays today because they played 2 days ago. But again, I don't know. I don't think they play though. I don't believe their schedule works out that way. Wisconsin would, at the very least, take the 2 spot for a couple days with a win. And with a loss, Ohio State would fall to 5-5. Now, with a win with Minnesota against Maryland, Minnesota would move to 5-4 and pass Ohio State for the 6th spot in the Big Ten. Now, here's where things get interesting. What if Maryland wins? What if Maryland pulls off the upset? They move to 3-6 on the year, 9-7 overall. They can actually go up 3 spots, if you can believe it, even though Maryland hasn't won in like a long... they're only on 1-game losing streak, but they haven't looked good in a long time. If they are able to pull off the upset today against Minnesota, they pass Michigan State, Northwestern, and Rutgers, which is pretty insane if you think about it. How I don't know. It's been a long time since Maryland's been that great. It could pass a pretty good Rutgers squad and a pretty good Michigan State squad. Now, Northwestern is starting to look like bottom of the Big Ten barrel. We'll see what happens when they play Penn State this weekend. Penn State is literally bottom of the barrel. Only Nebraska is really worse than them at this point. Although Penn State did pick up a quality win against Rutgers a few days ago, so that'll be interesting. But, again, with a Northwestern loss today to Penn State, Maryland has a chance to pass 3 teams. So they have a lot to play for here. Now, again, if Minnesota loses, they move to 4-5, fall below Indiana. So, again, don't want to do that. They want to keep their spot. And, in fact, with a win and an Ohio State loss, they move up 1. So I think I've went over the Big Ten relatively well. It's difficult to look at from it's pretty crazy from any perspective you look at it. So, today, we have, of the ranked teams, we have Baylor, Kansas, and West Virginia, I believe, playing. I believe Texas Tech is not playing this week. So what happens with a Baylor loss? With a Baylor loss, Baylor moves to 6-1. Now, again, Baylor has won 13 straight games from last season. They're 13 games, this year. That's not including their win streak over last season. They're 13-0 this year, right? So, the big question is, what happens with a win? So, Oklahoma State is playing Baylor this week, right? So, the big freaking question is, can Oklahoma State beat them? Now, if Oklahoma State beats them, they move to 10-3 overall, 4-3 in conference, and they can move past a team. So, I know you're thinking a team, that's very vague, but Oklahoma and Kansas play. So, whoever wins the Oklahoma-Kansas game moves to the 3 spot, while the other loser falls to 4-4. So, if Oklahoma State was to upset Baylor today, they would move up 1 spot ahead of either Oklahoma or Kansas, depending on who wins. And it's really, there's no point spread there. It is an even spread, so it's literally anyone's ball game, which is interesting. Again, West Virginia is playing Kansas State today, and West Virginia is right now not doing great in the Big 12 little battle, sitting in 7th place, but they are a ranked basketball team. Kansas State, on the other hand, is sitting at 1-6. With a win, that doesn't really do much for them other than move them to 2-6. They would still retain possession of the 9th team in the Big 12, only Iowa State being behind them, but it would give them a little bit of comfort space to be ahead of Iowa State by 2 games instead of just 1. Plus, with another win, and the next time they play, they can move past a team like TCU, West Virginia, So, there's that to look forward to if you're a Kansas State fan. But I don't know. I don't think Kansas State's doing that well this year. They're not looking like a good basketball squad. I don't know if they can beat West Virginia. Now, with the West Virginia win and an Oklahoma State loss to Baylor, which is a likely scenario, Oklahoma State drops below West Virginia and becomes 7th in the Big 12. But again, Oklahoma State has a good amount to gain from a win, also moving up to the 6th spot, depending on if Oklahoma or Kansas wins. So I think I went over the Big 12. Okay, ACC time. So as many of you know, there is 3 ranked teams in the ACC right now, and all 3 are playing this week. So let's go over the Virginia-Georgia Tech stuff first. Okay, if Virginia wins, they stay atop the ACC. It's that simple. They're 6-0 in conference. They're not, unless someone beats them, they're the team that's going to win it again. But again, teams like Virginia Tech, Florida State, Pitt, Georgia Tech, all on their tails, playing very good basketball. All those teams at the moment. So what would happen with a loss for Georgia Tech? Georgia Tech would fall to 3-2 and would likely drop a spot. Not too bad for Georgia Tech, but also being in the top 4 would be crazy for a team like Georgia Tech, a team that didn't have that high of expectations heading into the year, right? If you fall to 3-2 in conference, 7-3, Louisville would pass you for that 5 spot, and you'd be ahead of Duke still, mainly because of overall record, right? So the big question is, what would happen with the Georgia Tech win, right? So if Georgia Tech was to upset Virginia, Virginia would fall to 5-1 in conference, and then it would very much be dependent on whether Virginia Tech wins. But we'll go over those games in a moment. So if Georgia Tech was to win, it'd move to 4-1 in conference, 8-3, and they would bump past Florida State for the, well, actually, no. They would move to 4-1 in conference, but both of them would have an 8-2 record and an 8-2 record. Which also leads me to talk about other stuff that's going to happen too. But Georgia Tech would have to hope for one of those teams to lose, right? To be able to get in the top 5, but also assures them the spot at number 5, right? Let's go on to the next game. So Virginia Tech this week is playing a Syracuse team. A Syracuse team that's not horrible, but also not great, right? So with a Syracuse win, they move to 3-3 in conference, 9-4 overall, and they would stay where they are because Clemson has the same conference record as them. Now, if Virginia Tech would lose, that's not great for Virginia Tech. They could end up falling as far as to the 5 spot from where they are sitting currently at the 2 seed. So now it is possible if Syracuse could pass Clemson if Clemson was to lose to Florida State this weekend. Now, if Florida State was to lose, if Clemson was to lose, and Syracuse was to beat Virginia Tech, Syracuse would pass Clemson, and Clemson would fall a little bit lower, even though they were number 2 last Saturday. I was talking about how Clemson could be leading the ACC. I'm talking about how they could be in 9th, 10th place at this point. It's insanity of how far Clemson has fallen in such a short amount of time. Right now, Syracuse is not looking like a bad squad, so I think they have a definitely shot at beating the Hokies this weekend. But if the Hokies were to win, Virginia was to lose again, then Virginia Tech would take the lead in the ACC, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. I don't know if anyone picked the Hokies to actually win the ACC this year, but it's a very real possibility, right? If Florida State was to lose to Clemson again, Pitt would pass them, and with a win, Georgia Tech would pass them as well, right? So some stuff can work out in the ACC. This whole conference could look a lot different depending on the 3 big games this weekend. In American basketball, we have Houston. That's basically the only team we're going to be looking at in the American from now on, really. So Houston this week is playing Temple. Now with a win, Temple moves to 3-3, 4-3 overall, and they just stay where they are, which is currently in the 7th seed in the American Conference, right behind South Florida and just ahead of East Carolina, right? So it's definitely interesting. It's a game that, I don't know, Temple doesn't really need, they're still a whole game ahead of East Carolina. And Houston gets a pretty huge lead if they get this win. So it's 8-1 in conference, with the closest one being 4-2 in conference, and it's Wichita State. So again, nothing really crazy happens. With a loss, Houston stays in first place, and Temple stays in 7th. With a Houston win and a Temple loss, Temple lays in 7th, and Houston stays in 1. So nothing's gonna happen with that ranked. So Pac-12, some Pac-12 stuff is happening. We have 2 ranked Pac-12 teams, which me and the AP poll do not agree at all whether these teams should be ranked. But UCLA is playing Stanford this week, and Oregon is playing Oregon State. Now, Stanford's a team that I've been high and low on throughout the year. They've lost 2 straight. They're not a horrible squad, but they're also not a great one either. they have one great player, and it's this Stanford forward named Da Silva. He leads the Pac-12 in 30-plus games with 2, free throws with 61, and points with 251, right? So he's doing some good things over there in the Pac-12, but it's just being overshadowed by the fact that he plays in the Pac-12. So can they pull off the upset? So let's see what happens if they pull off the upset. If they pull off the upset, they move to 5-3 in conference. But again, Arizona, Colorado have the same record, and they don't have and Stanford would only have a 9-5 record, which 11-4 records and 11-3 records are both better than that. So with a win, Stanford stays where they are. Now with a loss, on the other hand, it moved to 4-4. Well, by the way, if UCLA was to lose to Stanford, they move to 8-1. It doesn't really affect them that much, but it would affect their reputation a bit. So if Stanford was to lose to move to 4-4, and Oregon State was to upset Oregon, Oregon State would pass Stanford. Although there's some stuff that would have to happen. Now, if Oregon State was to upset Oregon, Oregon would fall to 4-2, and USC has a better record at 5-2 in conference, so USC would pass Oregon in that scenario, and Oregon State would pass Stanford, as I said before. With a Stanford loss and an Oregon State win, they can move up. So, in the SEC basketball standings, we have 2 teams, 3 ranked teams playing today in Alabama, Tennessee, and Missouri. Now, those are 3 of the top 4 teams in the SEC, and if we're going to really talk about it, there's really only 5 teams, maybe, that should be in playoff consideration. Now, Alabama is playing Mississippi State today. So if Mississippi State was to upset Alabama, they move to 5-3 in conference and would be able to pass Florida for the 4th spot in the SEC. And Alabama would lose. They would only move to 7-1 in conference, but they'd still keep the lead in the SEC. Now, the real battle here to watch is the Tennessee-Missouri game, because Tennessee-Missouri determines the 3 and the 4 seed. If Tennessee wins, they retain possession of they can actually move to the 2 seed with a win, right? And with a loss, Missouri falls to 3-3, and it would again drop down to they would drop to the 6th seed. Okay, Florida and Mississippi State could both achieve a lot from a Missouri win. A Missouri loss, right? So obviously, if Mississippi State wins and Missouri was to lose, some good things can happen for Mississippi State. They can move all the way up to the 4th spot in the SEC. Now, with a Missouri win and a Tennessee loss, Tennessee would drop 1 spot to the 4th spot, and Missouri would move to the 3 seed. So, some things can happen, to be sure, in the SEC. It's going to be interesting, to be sure, this Saturday. And our last conference, we have Gonzaga taking on Pacific. Now, again, not a whole lot's going to change here, even with if Pacific, which is, oh, by the way, Gonzaga's favorite 25.5 points in this game, so it's not a likely upset. If Pacific was to pull off the absolute miracle and upset Gonzaga, they'd still stay in the 3 seed in the WCCC, the West Coast Conference. Now, if with a loss, Gonzaga would still stay in the lead in the WCCC. So nothing really happens. The only thing that would change anything would be the likely event where Gonzaga wins and Pacific loses. Pacific would drop to 2-2 on the year and would fall from the 3 spot to probably the 5 spot behind Pepperdine in San Francisco, which is actually what I expected to start out the year. I think Pepperdine and San Francisco are probably the 3rd and 4th best teams, and actually I think do have a significant chance of upsetting at least Gonzaga and BYU. They're going to give them trouble because I think they're both very well-coached basketball programs. But who do GGB think will be upset this weekend? I'm going to go with Florida State over Clemson. Now, I do think Clemson's hit a little bit of a dry spell here after looking very promising to start the year. That humiliating loss to Virginia, and then also being pretty much dominated by the Yellow Jackets. Florida State's a better team than I believe the Yellow Jackets are. I think the Seminoles are very good this year. Florida State's shooting 38.8% from behind the arc. This leads the ACC. They're a very good team this year. Anyways, this is GGB. Carlos Pepper saying adios, amigos, and go Seminoles.